Education and Volunteer Coordinator at Community Homeworks. If you're joining us live, please feel free to comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you would like to join in on the discussion or ask questions, please put that in the comment section as well. If you're watching this after the live broadcast, we're still happy to answer your questions. It just may take us a little longer to respond. Community Homeworks is a nonprofit organization with a mission to empower homeowners to maintain safe, sustainable, and dignified homes. We get our funding from grants, gifts, and donations. So if you find value in this workshop tonight, we encourage you to donate on our website at communityhomeworks.org. Tonight's workshop is titled Wall Repairs, and we have none other than our own magnificent Mr. Lee Taylor here tonight. Thank you so much, Mr. Taylor, for being here. We're looking forward to learning more about wall repairs.
All right. You can't see me way over here, can you? Okay. I'll move. Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, wall repair. Basically, there are kind of three different types of walls out there in the world. One of them is what's called a plaster wall, and we'll go into exactly what makes that a plaster wall. The other is just your standard drywall, and that comes in sheets and different thicknesses and whatnot. And then in between, there was something called plasterboard. So it was similar to drywall, but it wasn't in big 4x8 or bigger sheets. And they would put, most of the often, they would put a thin coat of kind of a plaster over it. So depending on when, your home was built, kind of dictates what you're going to run into. I'm going to start with the wall, basically just how a wall is built, real quick. And like I said, you guys have an outline. You can kind of follow along also. Now, as far as your wall goes, this is a plaster wall. I'm going to trip myself. So there are studs behind the wall, and the spacing on those studs it depends. Most of the older homes are about 16 inches on center. They can be up to 2 foot on center. So you have your studs. You may also have what's called fire blocking inside, and those are horizontal pieces of 2x4, whatnot, to be able to, if a fire ever got inside the wall. It's also, with the older homes, they didn't necessarily have too much of a top plate. So the issue is that if a fire got inside the wall, it would just shoot straight up into the second story. So kind of a retrofit over the years, if people are working on, it's called balloon framing. If people are working on that, they're going to put those horizontal blocks in, and that acts as a fire stop. I could keep going, but that's the basics of it. So we'll start with plaster walls. So with plaster walls, and this is just drywall. I don't know if you guys can see over here or not. With your plaster wall, a lot of times the plaster itself is not necessarily the same thickness throughout the wall. Corners may be thicker. You may have, you can have plaster that's a good 2.5 inches thick down to, like half an inch thick or so. And that could kind of just boils down to the studs back then weren't necessarily unified as far as all the same width, thickness, all that sort of stuff. So you had a lot of variation in the wall, which really wasn't that big of a deal, because what they do is they'd build that wall, and then they'd put what is called lath board in, and that's what these are right here. And they would have, anywhere from, it averaged probably about a half inch or a little less gap in between. And then what they would do is they'd mix up the plaster, the base coat, and slather that on and really push it in between the lath. And what it did, you probably have a picture of it right there. I'll do a little side thing of it. So this is a side view of the lath. What it would do is that plaster was applied. Not one that didn't mark. There it is. So the plaster is applied, that first coat, and they push it through, and it creates these little keys. And that's what helps hold that on, you know. And these little keys kick down like this, and there's a whole bunch of them, all right. And then what would happen is they'd go through after that dried, and they'd put a second coat on, and then sometimes they would put, see if this black works. Yeah, like a finish coat on. And that's, again, what they're doing is they're working on getting that wall nice and flat. But the bulk of the work is done by that first coat. What happens over time with plaster is a couple things. Usually what happens is that these little keys start to break. And when they break, you can get a separation from your lath board. And you've probably seen it where, you know, you have a wall where you walk up to it and you press on it and the whole wall does this sort of thing. And that's an indication that those keys are, you know, most of those keys have broke and there's not much holding that plaster on anymore. It's even more pronounced in ceilings. You get a stick and you're like, and that ceiling is doing one of these sort of things. Or it just, you just have pieces pieces that fall off. Not quite as nice as this, but so if you have plaster walls, what you're going to want to do is if you have a section that's say loose or sagging or anything along that line, it's tempting to get your hammer out and go ahead and break that off. Don't do that. The reason is that as you're pounding on that, you're breaking more and more of those keys, and that hole is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes it doesn't even necessarily show up right away. So what I like to do is gently pull that plaster off, you know. And again, you're gonna see varying thicknesses and whatnot. So I get in there and I'll gently pull that plaster out until I'm down to something solid. Again, you don't want to be pounding on it. Until I'm into something solid, and then I'm going to clean out. You know, you may have plaster stuck in between in areas, so you want to clean that out and just shove it in the wall. It's not going to hurt much. And then what you're going to want to do is you can get different thicknesses of drywall. So drywall, you can buy it. You can buy it in 1/2 inch. You can buy a 1/4. You can buy it in 5/8, 3/8, around 5/8. So you can get a bunch of different thicknesses. The issue is that most of the time they sell it in like a 4x8 sheet. But if you have a lot of repairs to do, say in a house, you can have it delivered, or you can cut it down in the store to get it into a vehicle or something along that line. But what you want to do is you're going to want to add up whatever the thickness is. So sometimes you're buying a variety of thicknesses. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get that, take it home, match up how many layers you need. And what you want is, this is about 1 inch thick-ish. So what I do is I want to make sure that when I put my final piece in, or one piece or whatever, that it's just a hair short. You don't want it protruding out. I mean, that's just a lot more work you're going to deal with. So let it sink in, a little bit. You can cheat sometimes. I've seen it where, just no matter what you do as far as your combination, it doesn't quite work. So you can get sometimes you can get little pieces of wood or something along that line and put it in just so that it's going to fur it out a little bit so that you're not having to use so much. So there's a couple of different ways to do it, but just make it so it's a little shy of that surface. As far as cutting this drywall, you're going to have a backside. That's a kind of a brown side. And the front is usually white. Sometimes it's blue or green or something along that line. That's usually meant for higher moisture areas like bathrooms, sometimes kitchens, stuff like that. But what you're going to do, yeah, see, nice. What you're going to do to cut this is you can use just this general utility knife, and you're going to cut just through this paper, because all this drywall is just gypsum in the middle with paper on the front and back. You can actually see how that is. And all I'm going to do is score on the front side. I score a little bit, and it breaks. I bend it like that. And I just get my utility knife and score that backside and snap that out, and I can get down the pieces that I need. As far as applying it, you know, if you want to get a really tight fit, most of the time I'm not too terribly worried about that. You know, if I were to put a piece in and I was, you know, shy a half inch or something along that line around the edges, I'm not going to worry about that too much. So I'm going to cut that piece out. If you have rounded edges, you can use something like a jab saw to get in there and cut it out a little bit. Like I said, it makes a mess. Usually I'll do that outside and bring it in, or if I'm, you know, working on something major, just make a mess on the floor. So get your pieces so that they fit into whatever area. And what you're going to do is there are a couple of ways that you can attach the drywall itself. There's the old school way of nails. You just figure out a reason why we don't want to necessarily use nails for dealing with a plaster wall. Right. So you don't want to be pounding drywall in there. So again, you know, use screws. You're going to have to match the screw for what the thickness is, because you're trying to get that screw to dig into either the stud, the vertical stud, or the horizontal lath. So when you're running that in, let's see if I actually have a piece that's going to actually work. I don't want to make too big of a mess. Oh. So I can get in here, score that a little bit. I'm going to make a mess in here. And most of the time, I don't have to worry about that. See, this one's pretty close. See, there's a gap here. That is, if I were to put another piece on, it would be way too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave that alone. Did somebody want to come up here and try this? Want to try it? All right. I'm going to let you. What I need you to do is kind of put it in there. You can score the backside with the knife. Just hold it. Yeah, for our purposes tonight. Yeah, we just score the backside there, and I'll get some other stuff set up. So with the plaster, all right, with the plaster fix, yep, you can just break that and then just cut it. You want to cut the backside? There you go, or the front side. You have a couple of different types of mud out there. You have all-purpose joint compound, and then you have kind of a topping compound with a lighter, easier to sand. All right, so you got that. So,
Mr. Taylor, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you do Why did you break it apart into two pieces? What do you do with the other piece?
With that scrap piece.
Well, not so much a scrap piece, but
Oh, in here,
mm-hmm.
normally you'd fill that. For our purposes right now, I'm
Yes,
just
sir.
yeah, I'm just kind of treating this the way it is here. So what you're gonna want to do, use your screw gun, and you want to throw a couple screws in. Make sure you're digging into something. So again, you're kind of figuring out where your studs are and where your lath is. Yeah, you can, just a couple in there. That'll work. Give you that. And you want to, when you're putting screws in, normally the wall doesn't move. When you're running screws in, yep, that's it. So you want to make sure, especially if it's real close to the surface, that screw head is not sticking out. But you don't want to be going in so hard that you punch through the paper. So, you have to kind of watch that. That's where the clutch on that drill driver works nice. So what you can do is you can set that down to whatever it is you're screwing into and get it close and be able to tweak it. So that works just fine. We can go ahead and set that guy down. So as far as the mud goes, like I said, this is just your general purpose mud, and it's not that thick. But sometimes people like to thin it out a little bit to work with it a little better. If you're dealing with mud that may have been dried up a little bit or something like that line, you can add just a little bit of water to it. So I'll just add just a couple of drops to that. And again, it depends on how much you have in your pan. And you just kind of mix it up to make it a little more workable. The thing about drywall mud is you don't want it too thin. This stuff, a lot of people call it like a taping compound or something like that. So that you especially don't want real thick. So I just kind of mix it up. So I'm flinging mud everywhere. Give you that guy. And this is just a pan. So what we're going to do, obviously don't go over here. So we're just going to kind of fill in and get it close. And I'm going to get some pieces of paper. So anytime you have a combination of different materials, the joint and something like that, you can put mud in there, but you don't want to leave it. You want something that's going to reinforce that joint. And there's a couple of different things out there in the world. Most common is a paper. And this is, just about everybody has this. You can find it just about anywhere. And what you're going to do is you're going to figure out how long of a piece you need. And you're going to cut it with scissors or something along that line. And the other one you have, like there's a lot of varieties out there. Find the end. Sure. Somebody have fingernails? Yeah. Can you find the end of that thing? Because I don't have fingernails. Okay, that's good there. So what you want to do now, so you can see how she kind of packed that in. See that? And when you're packing that in, you want to kind of mush that in, similar to what we were talking about as far as getting that drywall compound really mushed in there. Don't worry if it's dripping around. We can kind of clean it. Now, where you want that joint for this paper, you want that paper to overlap this edge and down onto this. Oh, you found it. Thank you. So what you're going to want to do, set it down, I'll grab it in a sec, is you're going to want to put what's called a bedding coat just on the surface of the main wall. So you're putting in maybe just a thin layer. I'll let you go ahead and put that thin layer on in here. Thin enough to be able to hold this, because you want it to bed in. And the thing about drywall mud is, and finishing and all that sort of stuff is, it is an art form. It really is. It's better to, if you're not sure, to put on a little less, because what's going to happen is that you're going to have to sand that down smooth later, and it can create a dusty, nasty mess. So we put a thin layer on. Technically, you're supposed to wet these down a little bit, the paper. So some people have another pan or something like that, but you can do it that way. Now what you want to do is take your paper. Yeah, we'll set that down there. And you want it to go onto each. And what that does, you're going to go down. You're actually going half on and half on. There you go. So you can just kind of push it in. Then you get your knife and you bed that into the mud with your knife. You don't want to necessarily use your fingers too much. You can use that same knife. And what you're going to do is you're going to be bedding that into that drywall mud. Trick is that sometimes it wants to move on you. And if you're doing longer runs or something along that line, it can turn into a bit of a battle. But the idea is that you want it fully bedded in. And you can see how here it's not. And it's gonna be one of these sort of things where it's indented in, and that's fine. That's going to be dealt with later. And what this does, see how this is, see how you have a bubble? So get right in there. There you go. And just press it right in. There you go. Like I said, that first coat's going to look a little gnarly, but that's all right. Go ahead and bend this guy in there. There you go. What that paper does, is it makes it so that it's less likely to crack. All right. If we were to just do this, it most likely would crack out over time. So that's a paper method. There is what's called, this is a self-stick fiberglass. And I will cut a piece of this. And this is the same concept. The only thing about this is you don't need a bed of mud. So see how this is built up here? Go ahead and smooth that out a little bit. You can just take that knife and there you go. And this has a slight sticky back. So you can just go ahead and press that in. There is a downfall to this style. Same half and half, yep. And sometimes you have to do it in pieces, because you may have a kind of a crazy corner. So that, yep. And sometimes it's easier just to bed that in first and then try to bend it around. Now, remember I said they're self-stick? Sometimes they're not. Just like that. So if you're running into that issue, you can just get a little bit of mud and you can push it right through that mesh and smooth it out a little bit. Trick is to do that. Sometimes it wants to, it wants to move on you a little bit, and you end up with these little wrinkles in there. So, like I said, that fiberglass mesh is nice because it's strong. It's less likely to crack and all this sort of stuff. But the issue is that crosshatch of the fiberglass, you may just have to get more mud in there and just fill it in a little bit. Sometimes that fiberglass mesh can kind of transfer through, especially on this finished surface out here. So it usually requires a little more finesse when you're in that second phase of putting a final coat over the top. All right. So now you got it bedded in. And like I said, this would go all the way around. See your knife here real quick.
Mr. Taylor.
Yeah.
Why do people use fiberglass?
Why would they? it is better as far as not necessarily cracking. There's another style I'm going to tell you about. Um, the paper can crack, but I think it depends on a few things. So basically, you're going to get that in. You're going to get it, as I said, as close to the surface as you can without protruding past. You're going to set your bed in. And at that point, you're going to leave it alone. But what you want to do first is kind of clean off anything that is sticking out that you're going to have to end up sanding later. All right. And you can kind of see it. Well, I don't know if you can see it or not, but see how this is transferring through? You can kind of see that crosshatch a little bit there. But you want to be able to knock down as much of the ridges as you can. Except we're not worried about making it smooth yet. We're going to let it dry. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come in. We can use this green tape or this green mud, or we can use what's called a topping compound. It's a little bit lighter and it's easier to sand. So you notice that we were doing all this with just a narrow mudding knife. Give that back to you. So obviously you do however many patches you needed to do, and that would go all the way around. You need to let that dry, usually overnight. It kind of depends. But what you can do is you can get wider, different style knives and stuff. And for demonstration purposes, we'll say that's dry. All right. So now what you're going to want to do is you have a variety of widths. And he said if all you have is something like this, about this width, this is about 5 inches or so wide, that's fine. You can buy simple drywall tools. If you're doing multiple areas or a larger area, I would say buy a wider knife. All right. And he said you don't have to buy the world's best. You can go out and buy a relatively inexpensive one. What you want to make sure of with these drywall knives is that somebody didn't drop them or use them as a chisel or something along that line. Because if there's little nicks or dings in that metal, it's going to leave stripes all over the place. When you start getting into these wider knives, if you look at it, see how that's curved? So there is a curve here. It runs this way. And that's where you want that surface to be up against your wall. And the reason is that when you're doing that, when you're putting that mud on, it's going to taper out, taper down and taper out. So let's go ahead and put more mud in that. I'm going to let you scoop it out. Oop. We're going to get mud all over the nice table. Oh, well. And when you're putting this in a pan like this, you want the pan to be clean. You don't want dried crud in there and stuff. Again, if you're getting that dried stuff in there, it's going to, that's good. Yeah, that one more and you're good. So now, what you're going to want to do, let's put just a little bit of water in. Normally, if I'm doing a top coat, I'll use what's called a topping compound, but there's nothing really wrong with using the green. I'll let you put just a little bit of water and then use that to mix it up. Like a teaspoon. Yeah, just a little bit. Just enough to kind of make it a little bit easier to work with is really what we're going after. And a lot of times I'll use, you can do this in a bucket and stuff too. Some people, especially if you have a decent amount of work that you're going to be working on, if you have a small bucket like this, you can use like this is a thing you'd hook onto the drill and be able to stir up that mud. So it makes it, it makes it nice so you can work with it a little bit easier. Or you can just do it right in the pan. It just kind of depends. All right. Now we'll set that off to the side. We'll set it up here. When you're doing this, you're going to want to hold this real quick. So I'm going to look at it and identify which side has the bend. I'm going to scoop a little bit. And that way, when I'm grabbing it, normally this pan would be a little bit fuller. But I'm getting a full width on that blade. So I'll let you take that. And this is where the artwork comes in, right? Where do you want to start? Obviously, you'd start here. And yep, you're just pulling it. And normally, yes, it would all be filled in and whatnot. You're just kind of packing that in. Yeah, it can be fun. So, the thicker it is, the longer it's going to take to dry type thing. And because we're doing this when it's wet, it's acting a little bit different. But like I said, and you can see right here where there was a piece of something that left, whatever. Now, normally it wouldn't be quite that thick. If you wanted to, you could get a little bit of mud and throw that in there and then use that as your final go around. Yeah. So you can go like this if you need to. And normally you don't want it too thick. This is the thing, is when it starts to get really thick, it can act up a little bit. So I'll let you go ahead and see if that smooths that out a little more. All right. Now you can see how it's building up down here. Yep. You can just kind of do that. And you want to put it back in the pan. As long as you're not, I'll let you hold that pan. As long as you're not introducing stuff to it. And like I said, finish work is, it can be annoying occasionally. Now you can see even with this finishing up top here, this is a little thick still on top. You can see how you have these ridges and stuff, but you can see where this mesh tape is transferring through, and you can see that crosshatch, and that can be annoying after a while. And sometimes you may have to do it in lifts, say. So, if it's getting thick or something along that line, let it dry and then go after it again. And then sometimes with drywall mud, sometimes it is best just to stop and let it go. So you see how, I don't know if you guys can see this or not really. You can see how there's a ridge right here. You can see how there's these little spots right here in this. All that's going to have to be sanded. So what I do is when I get to that point where I'm going to leave it alone, I'm going to clean my knife off. And I personally, and this is just me, I hold it like this. But I'm going to get in there. I hold it like this personally, and this is a personal preference on my part. But what I'll do is when I put that knife on, I'm going to kind of put a little more pressure to the outside. And so I'm taking advantage of that taper that's built in to that knife. And see, there's that mesh that I was talking about acting up again. And I'm just doing a real light pass over it, just so I'm not having to sand as much. Little ridge or something like that, not that big of a deal. When this dries, you will want to go ahead and hit it with some sandpaper. Obviously, we can't do that tonight, but a couple of different ways you can be able to sand that out. You can use just your standard sandpaper and use a sanding block. I mean, something like this or whatever. Don't use your hands. Some people just get some sandpaper and fold it up and go ahead and sand. Don't do that. It leaves ridges and whatnot. So something flat, even if it's a piece of 2x4 that you wrap a piece of sandpaper around, something. And when you're sanding, where you can do something like this, where it's actually a sanding screen. These are nice, they last longer. But when I go ahead and sand this, I want to use as wide of a piece as I can. I'm going to start on the edges. And I'm going to kind of knock those high spots down. I call them a hard edge, where you have this line that just goes. So I sand that down, and then I'll sand it along this way just to kind of knock off the worst of it. And then I go ahead and I clean that off, usually a damp rag or something along that line. And I can put my finish coat on along with that wider knife. So, and again, that it is a feel thing. And he said usually what happens is that people will put way too much on, and then they're sanding and sanding and sanding. And when you're sanding, you don't want to sand off all the mud. You want it to be tapered out. So it's one of those feel things. You have to kind of play around with it to be able to get a feel for how much you need to sand off or how much you need to put on. But that's the idea. Like I said, you just don't want to leave raw edges where you don't have either a paper or fiberglass mesh that's covering that joint. There is another style of mesh out there that's not, it's made out of fiberglass. I was just actually introduced to this just recently. It's not the crosshatch stuff like this, but what it is, it's still fiberglass, but it's much smaller pieces, and it doesn't have this cross pattern in it. But it's really nice because what it does is that you put it on just like that paper, and it just kind of melts right into the mud. I was going to grab a piece of it. I was thinking about it today, and then I didn't. But they sell them in a lot of the box stores and stuff. So it's just, it looks similar to the paper, but if you were to look at it close, you'd see those small pieces of fiberglass built right into it. Those are nice because you don't end up with this, but it's stronger than that paper. So it's one of those things that's pretty easy to be able to do. Like I said, that first coat looks a little gnarly. Don't worry about it too much. You can cover that stuff up. When you sand this down, we were talking about, you're making a nice, relatively smooth and stuff. I wipe it off with a damp rag or something like that just to get off all that dust and whatnot, and then go ahead and put that final coat on or a second coat of the green. It just kind of depends, When you think you're done, go ahead and wipe off the dust and whatnot. If you have like a primer coat or a primer, just a simple wall primer or something like that, go ahead and prime the area, and then get just a bare bulb light and have somebody hold it. And what you're doing is you're looking at it in this direction, and it will show up any imperfections. And you can then, if you see spots where it's either high or low, you can go ahead and put mud on even over that primer. It's not going to hurt anything to be able to touch it up. By shining that light on and looking this way on the wall, it makes it so you can see those imperfections. And the thing to think about too is with paint, the more sheen there is on the paint, the more it's going to show up those little imperfections and stuff. So at that point, it just depends on how picky you are, as far as how far you want to go to make it dead flat or not. And sometimes it boils down to what your actual wall is. If you have a texture on it, and some of these do, have fun with that one. There are so many different textures out there. Some are made with an actual tool, like a swirl. Some are, made with like a smoosh down brush. It's called a stomp or whatever. Sometimes there are textures out there where you can get just a thick paint roller and thin down your mud and practice on a scrap piece of drywall and see if that matches. Sometimes that's what it needs. So, sometimes you have to kind of just play around with it to be able to see. But like I said, plaster balls, usually are going to be a little bit harder to deal with, just because they have oddball thicknesses and whatnot that we talked about. So does this make sense to a point? If you have a huge area that's damaged, sometimes it's just easier to take it out and put in just a larger sheet of OSB, or I'm sorry, OSB drywall. I said if you're in higher moisture areas, bathrooms, that sort of thing, use something that's rated for that. And as I said, they're usually colored green or blue or purple or something along that line. Is there any questions as far as this?
Yeah. How many coats should you apply before you say you're done?
Well, at least 2. So you have your bedding coat to be able to bed in whatever you're using as far as your mesh tape or your paper tape or your fiberglass tape or something along that line. And ideally it's real close. So all you're doing is really bedding that in. You're not having to necessarily do this. But this is the issue with plaster walls, again, where you're talking about those different thicknesses. So usually at least 2. Once you get really good, usually know that somebody's been doing drywall for quite a while, because they can come along and you're like, well, damn, it looks really good already. And you have to remember too, as it dries, it's going to shrink and crack and whatnot. So I mean, when this dries up, it most likely is going to have little hairline cracks in it and stuff. And that's where it's just you're putting it on too thick. So again, it just kind of depends on what you're playing around with. So does that make sense? All right. Done with plaster walls, because about 15 minutes. So if you have a roller that doesn't want to roll, if you have drywall or plasterboard, sometimes, let's say this is a good example, like a doorknob or something, punch through it, right? And what you're going to want to do is, you don't have that lath back there. Again, all you have are your vertical studs. So you can't necessarily cover up a hole that's this size. This size, you might be pushing it a little bit. It sort of boils down to what you're using. Do you want to try this one on drywall? So with drywall, if you have a big piece that you're going to have to be able to do, a couple of things you can do. If you have something that's about this size, it's not too bad. You can let's get a couple screws, get the screw gun there. You're going to want to put something in behind to act as a backer, whether it's for a backer for a piece that's going to go in there, or there's some screws, or it's a piece. So what you're going to want to do is you need to be able to hold this in there. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Some people will talk about drilling a hole through and running a wire and whatnot. But to me, sometimes if the hole's big enough and you're skilled enough, you can push it up in there, or you have a helper and you can hold it sometimes. Running your screw right down through there. I'll hold it. We're going to shift it over. There you go. I'm going to shift it over some. Go ahead.
Ready?
No. Oh, just run it. There you go. Oh, yeah. See how that, now, what happened there? That's actually good you did that. It broke, so there's nothing there left for that drywall to hold anymore. So this is where you're going to want to have, let's go ahead and put that right in there and go in straight. You're just going to go in a little bit so it holds. There you go. You can sometimes feel on the back side. I'll put this guy in. This is where the wire or something along that line makes more sense.
Or like cutting the hole out just
You can cut it up bigger. Yep, yep, you can do that too. Yeah, go ahead and run it. Good. That's fine. See, it kind of punched through the paper. So now you can go ahead and put another screw in right here. Like I said, this is just creating kind of a backer for it. And you can do a lot of different things. And yep, sometimes you can get in there and hold it. Did it? Grab it. Oh, you just missed the bottom. See? Yeah. So, that like that is good. Touching mud. Yuck. Then what you want to do is, I call them these bird edges here. You have these. So what you want to do is get a knife, kind of knock down those rough edges a little bit. You just get in there and just cut that paper out a little bit to make it smooth so you don't have these lumps that you're going to have to deal with later. Just kind of get in there and clean those up. And this is real similar to the plaster fixes, but the only difference is you have to put a backer in there. So, and if it's a smallish hole, like if it's a size, like this size, sometimes you can get away with just putting mud in there and putting a little bit of mud on the outside, and then the paper or that real thin fiberglass mesh I was talking about. And that guy, take him out. He's not there. Sometimes you can just go ahead and put that over it. The worst that's going to happen is that it'll fall through. So what you want to do is go ahead and get your mud. You're going to use your narrower knife. Set that guy off to the side. Yeah, here. Let's go. So what you're going to do is you're going to just kind of similar to what you did back there. You're going to just kind of pack it in around. You want to kind of angle that knife in so you're scraping it into the corners and stuff. And you're still going to make that space around the outside where you can put one or even two. Sometimes you have to put two pieces of paper on. You would. Yep. So what you're doing, so see how you got a little bit here, you may have to pull it up this way. There you go. And this is where when the mud's thin, it can be a little bit annoying. So like I said, that usually that green mud is a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, and it's going to help hold some of that stuff that you're trying to do. Yep, just kind of go ahead and mush that in. There you go. And I'll get you some. What do you want? Fiberglass. All right. Because if you're using the fiberglass, then you don't need to necessarily have too much of. So what you want to do is you want to make it so that it's onto good drywall, but not so much that you're having more work for yourself. Does that make sense? So in this case, I'm going to hold this up here. I'm going to say, I want to go about an inch or so above, inch or so past. Give you that one. And I'll do another one, because what you're going to have to do, normally you're not doing that on the wall. Don't cut it on the wall. So what you're going to do is you're going to put a little bit, and then you're going to put the next one. Yep, just half and half, right? And he said if it presses in, don't worry too much about that. Now, if you don't feel like it's in there quite well enough, you can get a little more mud and just do a thin coat over it to kind of really bed that in. Paper especially. And he said this is kind of where that it's nice in a way that this stuff has a stick to it. It doesn't necessarily need to. I would go ahead and put a little more mud, and you just want to press that mud in. You want to use a wider knife. So let's use a knife like this. So this is about a 4 or so inch wide knife. Those don't necessarily have those bends in them that we were talking about with these wider ones. These wider ones are really for finish, so that you can have just the slightest bit of a hump where you're not necessarily noticing it. And you want to press that in because, like I said, as it dries, it's going to shrink down a little bit. There you go. And at this point, if you see a little bit of the mesh, not too big of a deal because, again, you're going to be going over the top of it and really feathering out that mud. That's fine, as long as it's not bubbling out. So if it's looking good, I would say at that point, you're good. Leave it alone. You don't have any real high ridges necessarily to, you have a little one right there. Yep. But let alone, let it dry, and go ahead and patch that. So, like I said, it's not necessarily a quick fix. They do sell patch kits. You can go ahead. We can set that guy down. This is an old guy right here. They sell patch kits that you iron and whatnot on the wall. I personally don't think these are needed anymore. I think that a lot of this was before you had kind of the self-stick mesh that you were using and stuff like that. But, again, it's kind of the same concept. There's a lot of different patches out there. But you can get away with these. As far as really, that's about the easiest way. Now, if your damage is bigger, if that hole is much bigger, say the kid put their head through the wall or something like that, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to figure out where your studs are at and cut out from stud to stud and square it off good and go ahead and put that whole piece in. But again, you're going to want to match up what the thickness of that drywall is. And most of them are 1/2 inch. Most of them. At that point, you don't necessarily need screws because, again, we're not dealing with lath. You can use nails if you want to, but most of the time people have screws laying around. So they can put those in. The thing to remember is that you don't want to overdrive those screws because if they're overdriven and they break that paper, it loses its strength. And it's more apt to just kind of and fall out later. So that's where that clutch setting on that comes into play. And you can really set that clutch setting pretty low and it will automatically stop once it hits that certain amount of resistance. And then you can just turn it up just a little bit and just make it so they're just sunk in a little bit. Trick with that is if you're not sure if they're sunk in enough, get your knife and you can run after you put let's say you have a larger piece, you can run it, and if you'll hear that ting of that head of that screw sticking out a little bit. So it's a nice way to be able to kind of figure out where do I have something sticking out. I just run that through and I'll listen for that ping. And sometimes I'll just get a hand screwdriver or get my drill driver and just tweak it a little bit. So outside corners are a different issue. Outside corners and inside corners, technically you can do them with the paper. If for some reason you have one of those to deal with, you can see that this paper has a crease in it, so I can bend it and use it for an inside corner, or I can use it for an outside corner. That will drive you nuts. I guarantee it, because if you're doing, let's say, an inside corner, you have damage or something like that. Let's say it's you had to do work around here or whatever, and you want to bed this in. You're going to do your bed coat of that mud, and then you're going to start at the top or wherever and bed it in and bed that tape in. And the trick is to not have it grab and move on you and everything else. Usually I'm going to say if you have a larger area, do it in pieces. Sometimes it's easier than having just a long piece that you're trying to work in there. And again, it's one of those things, the more you do it, the more you go, oh, yeah, okay. There are tools for that. You have inside corners. So this helps where if I have the tape in there, I can use this and it will bed both sides as I go. If I have an outside corner, I have tools for that also. So it's the same concept. It's just different tools. I personally don't use these usually, but they do have these. So, like I said, the drywall work, the finishing part of all this is really where, they say the devil lies in the details. Well, that's it, pretty much. If you are in a hurry, why? But let's say you're in a hurry and you want stuff to dry quicker, you can buy powder in little boxes or whatever. And it is a chemical dry. So this is a 5-minute. I've never used that. They have ones that are an hour or 45 minutes. Huh?
I think there's some in a
Oh, is there some in here? Oh, it's not marked. So, but it's just, oh yeah, here it is. Ooh, you can buy it in a box. You can buy it in a bag. So this is 20-minute stuff. I wouldn't use that either. But like I said, they have that out there. But read the instructions because it wants to be mixed with cold water. It needs to set for a certain amount of time and remixed. So there's a certain amount of steps. And it doesn't taste very good when you're sanding. Definitely wear your dust mask. I was doing my house and I was using 45-minute stuff because I could start in one corner and work my way all the way around. It would be dry by the time I hit that side, but it has a weird taste. But they have these that will dry a lot faster. They're not relying on how dry it is or whatnot in the house. So, like I said, a lot of different things. I will tell you with these, with that chemical dry stuff, once it starts to dry on you, it dries quick. I mean, you're in there working and all of a sudden you're going, I can't use this stuff anymore. And you're chiseling it out. So you have to watch how much you make at a time. I'm going to pick on plaster walls because we're quickly running out of time. Well, I'm going to pick on drywall and plaster walls. Sometimes you have just those hairline cracks. And what a lot of people are tempted to do is just get some of their mud and go and sand it and then leave. Problem is that will crack on you. So what you should do if you have those hairline cracks, especially in the plaster, is get in there. You want to clean off all that loose stuff. You can use, a putty knife, sometimes a little thinner putty knife like this, or like a painter's tool that has a little point on it. You can get in there and clean that stuff out. You do your mud, just like we were talking about. Give it a little bit of however wide the tape that you're using. Bed that in over that crack. And sometimes it's a crazy looking sort of mix. They're going this way. And bed those in. And then you can go ahead, once it dries, do a light sand on it. And then do your wider knife over it to be able to feather that out and blend it out. Sometimes you may have a crack where it's basically, they're usually on ceilings. It's where you get two different materials that are moving at different rates. So this crack may show up like in the winter or, only in the winter, and then it goes away in the summer or something along that line. So by putting drywall mud in there, even with like a paper or mesh over it, the tendencies for that to fail are pretty high. So if you have one of those reoccurring cracks and stuff, sometimes, as goofy as it sounds, is to get a good paintable, flexible caulk. And like I said, this is an Alex caulk. This is 35 year. It's paintable and everything else. And what I do is I clean it out just like I would for anything else, and then smear that caulk in and make sure it's nice and smooth. You want to, but what it's going to do is it's going to move as that wall moves. And sometimes the hardest part is making it look right. But like I said, you can use some kind of a flexible caulk in there. Don't think you're going to be sanding that caulk later, because you won't. You'll be going nuts trying to do it. So anytime I'm using caulk or something like that, yeah, I'm going to use a nice putty knife that has a bit of flex to it. There are those hard putty knives. You don't want to use those. The ones that have just that little bit of flex in them are nice, because I can press it right into that wall and actually get, a little bit of a bend to it and make it so that it's giving me a smooth thing. And I can do that with caulk also. So, and then you don't need to necessarily put tape over that or anything along that line. And then you just let it dry. Sometimes you may have to reapply a little bit, because, again, it may shrink when it dries. But that sometimes is a nice, easy way to be able to do that. The other thing, the last thing, because we're running out of time, is to clean your tools up. So you don't want to leave that. So it's just usually just water or something along that line. I do want to point out something. These particular pans, drive me nuts, because if you look at a clean one here, I bet you I can't get these out. Oh, got a pair of pliers. This comes out. This metal piece comes out of this. Is there a pair of pliers over there? And sometimes you need a pair of pliers to pull them out. If you have one of those, pull those out, because it'll work. There you go. Pull those things out and clean them separately, and then you can get in here and clean out all the gook in there and whatnot, and dry them. When you're done, I let them dry. I lay them inside or something like that, and then I put them back in. But it is one of those things that will drive you nuts, because what will happen is you get all this crud built on if you just leave them in. And then when it comes time to do, say, like your finish work or something, you're getting all this stuff into your finish work, and it's just you're screaming and yelling and throwing mud around, and bad news. So if you have a pan like this with these little metal pieces in it, pull those metal pieces out. Sometimes I'll use them to get in here and kind of clean out that guck. But you want those knives to be clean, the pans to be clean. Dry them. You can probably see how rusty that one was. They have a tendency to flash rust pretty quick. So I'll go through, clean off, especially these wider ones. A, they're more expensive. B, we were talking about that bend earlier. You don't want to damage them. So I clean those things up and dry them off once I'm all set. Warm water, a little bit of soap, brush, something along that line. So I'm not going to set that in there. But cleanup is one of those things. And two, if you're working in a large area, or you have a multiples to do, sometimes you just have to stop and clean your pan out, because you get those cruddy little bits that'll start to dry and cause problems later. So sometimes I'm cleaning that pan out as I go. The last thing to talk about is this. So you can buy these in little tubs, right? These little premix tubs, or a 5-gallon tub or something along that line. The issue is, if you look in there, everybody's scraped up on the side, and that's normal. That's what everybody does. So when you're done with it, get a small putty knife and scrape them off the sides, because what's going to happen is it's going to make it so that, people do that. It's going to make it so that you have a smoother finish, and you're not going to have as much crud on the sides. It's just going to get into your work later. Ideally, this has been shut while you're working with it, but what I like to do is, especially if it's close to, I know I'm not necessarily going to be getting into it for a little while, I'm going to put a little bit of water on top of this and then seal it up good. Some people even go as far as putting like saran wrap over it and making sure that it's, cleaned around the edges, and then snapping that on. Because there's nothing worse than opening up what you think you need and finding that. So And like I said, if you smooth it out, you think about it a little bit, it's going to last for quite a while. So, like I said, there are ways to make that stuff last. Air gets in there, it's just going to wreck it. So, it's just practice, 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 especially at the finishing part. Finding people to actually work. We were talking about textures and whatnot earlier. That is getting more and more difficult as time goes on. And to be able to find somebody that actually specializes and works in plaster. So, one of those things that if you find somebody, they're probably going to be expensive. I hate to say it. So, it is what it is. And we've gone only 5 minutes over, so not too bad.
No, no worries at all. Mr. Taylor, we want to thank you for your expertise and wisdom in wall repair. We will be seeing you in a couple weeks when we paint the walls that we've repaired.
We're gonna paint these. We
We're
gotta
gonna
finish.
paint
We
them
gotta finish
walls. We're
mudding
gonna
them.
finish mudding them and
Oh.
do all the things that we need to do to them. So we look forward to seeing you guys. We're welcoming you to our space. We're right on Bryant Street in the Edison neighborhood. We hold classes on Tuesday evenings at 6 o'clock, and we would love to see your face in the place. Have a good evening.